Good evening, and welcome to your North Carolina Museum of History. Yes, thank you. History happens here, and you're going to see it tonight. My name is Earl Imes, your farmer and historian, and I am the curator of African American history and agriculture here at the Museum of History. And it's my pleasure to be with you here this evening. And I want to welcome everyone here to the Museum to the Nice program for Rosenwald Schools. And the story of Rosenwald Schools serves as a reminder about the fight for equal rights for everyone, particularly African Americans, and the importance of preserving our material history. Before we go any further, though, I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge all of Rosenwald School alumni who are in the house. Anybody alumni? Yes. Big hand, thank you. People like me stand on your shoulders, so thank you very much. Without the efforts of these individuals and the communities, the Rosenwald School would have never been built. So thank you for being here tonight, and I hope you enjoy tonight's presentation to honor you. Are there any government officials or elected officials in the building? All right, well, I would like to, first of all, thank our director, Ken Howard, for helping to support this program, so thank you, Ken. Yes. So Rosenwald Schools, they changed the lives of countless African Americans across the South by extending the privilege of education. In the early 20th century, Southern states largely ignored the responsibilities, particularly to our African American population. And this started as a constructed mechanism going back to the Reconstruction era. In 1883, our North Carolina General Assembly passed what was called the Dortch Act, and it was popular, and it created a literal legal color line that helped to fund schools with the idea that black schools should be built with a separate fund. And many whites at that time believed that black schools didn't need more funding because of Northern philanthropists. And this law would later be thrown out by the state Supreme Court, but what it did is it set a precedent in 1883 for what we are going to talk about in the film, beginning with Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington in 1915, who, as Rosenwald, as CEO of Sears and Roebuck and Company, along with Booker T. Washington, helped to create this innovative approach to circumvent this unequal privilege of education. So from the 19 teens through about 1940, more than 5,300 school buildings were constructed in African American communities throughout 15 states across the country. And here in North Carolina, we took full advantage of that program and the opportunities that they provided. So this evening, the museum is pleased to host a viewing of the new documentary film, Unlocking the Doors of Opportunity, and the Rosenwald Schools of North Carolina, which tells the story of North Carolina's Rosenwald Schools and why the Jim Crow era made them necessary. And I want to particularly take the opportunity to thank some of the folks who were instrumental in beginning this Rosenwald School research. I would be remiss if I didn't thank Miss Betty Murchison, who I hope is here, but if she couldn't make it, I would like to thank her publicly now for her contribution toward preserving and acknowledging the Rosenwald Schools. Yes. Now, the film was produced by Lonely Productions. I love that title, Lonely Productions, based in Greensboro, North Carolina, and is scheduled to air on PBS next Thursday, a week from today, February 21st at 10 p.m. So major financial support for the making of the documentary came from the National Endowment for the Humanities and Truist, and a grant from the North Carolina Humanities Council supported taking the film screening and discussion events in several communities across the state, like this engagement that we have here this evening. So, including this program at the Museum of History. So it was my pleasure, and thank you, Tom and Jerry, for asking me and including me and my 2 cents worth. So thank you for that. And following the screening of the film, my friend and colleague, Goldsboro's finest, yes, Crystal Regan, the head of our education museum, yes, she will moderate a panel discussion with the film's producers and historians and the Rosenwald School alumnus. And so put your seatbelts on. You're in for a great time, and thank you again for coming.
Good evening, everybody. And it's such a pleasure and honor to have all of you join us this evening. What an awesome film. What an awesome film. Again, my name is Crystal Regan, and I'm Education Section Chief here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And it's my pleasure and honor to serve as moderator this evening. And I want to quickly introduce our distinguished panelists and guests. I'll make this very quick because we want to get to the content. We have Mr. Tom Lassiter with us, filmmaker and president of Longleaf Productions. Tom. We have Mr. Jerry Snyder, filmmaker and vice president of Longleaf Productions. We have Dr. Arwen Smallwood, interim vice provost for undergraduate education at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. I'm laughing because he's a Central undergraduate, so you know, I had to stress that. And we have Mr. Ben Stewart with us, product of the Rosenwald Schools. So thank you all for joining us. We're going to get right to it. We're going to have just maybe a 25-minute conversation, and then we're going to turn it over to you, the audience, for a question and answer session before we close out tonight. I will have questions for all the panelists. I may mention a specific person, but I want to say that I want all of you to chime in as you see fit in order to have a productive conversation. But I want to start first with the film for Tom and Jerry. Can you talk to us about making this documentary? What led you to this project? And what impact has this project had on you personally? So those two questions, and jump right in.
That's what happens when you're in the middle. We were working on another project for the North Carolina Rural Center, which you may have heard of. We were in the small town of Hamilton, North Carolina, which is on the Roanoke River. And we'd been asked to include in the story we were doing for them what they were doing with this old school that was in the town, and they were turning it into a river center for paddlers and so forth coming up the Roanoke River. And we found out that it was a Rosenwald school, and our initial reaction is, oh, what's that? We'd never heard of it, and a little further introduction to it, and we couldn't figure out why we had never heard of it. When we found out what they had done, for crying out loud, over 5,000 schools built all across the South, and nobody knew anything about it. And so we decided we would look into seeing if we could do that, tell the story. And we tried to raise some money, which we weren't very successful at that. But we did get the funds to do two films to show that what ought to be done, and one on North Carolina and one on South Carolina. We found out that the story of the Rosenwald schools, while it is a common story, it is totally different in every state. They reacted differently. That what they had to do with getting the funds and so forth was so different. We decided to go at it that way, and I believe it's paid off because if we did a national film, you'd get it on public television a couple of times and that'd be it. But here we can go around the state with groups like this and talk about the North Carolina experience. And our hope is that it leads to more of these so that we can get a dialogue started about this and hopefully solve some of our problems that we have in this state and other states.
Thank you.
Tom, you're on.
Well, Jerry's absolutely correct. We were introduced in Hamilton, which, contrary to what the film says, is in Martin County. So if I was still in the newspaper business, I'd run a correction tomorrow, but nonetheless. We were introduced to these three sisters who had attended this school when we went on that trip down to Hamilton. And they had all just recently retired and had had great careers in education and had gone from this two-room schoolhouse to teach school for 30 years in New Jersey, but not just taught school, but one of these ladies got 2 advanced degrees. And, my grandmother went to school in a one-room schoolhouse in Wisconsin, but these ladies were my age. And I thought, how come I don't know about this? And so we did. We delved into it and found local stories in local newspapers and local TV stations all about Rosenwald schools. But there was nothing that pulled it all together and said why they were necessary and said anything about the remarkable accomplishments of the alumni who were all around us. And we just kept chasing it.
Wonderful. That's awesome. And I think all of us who are lovers of history, we're excited to hear you say you started with those questions, because that's what leads us on these journeys. I'd like to ask, though, because you all featured the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of these philanthropists, these founders, and these leaders. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like working with them and trying to pull out that personal aspect of them talking about an ancestor? I'm thinking about Margaret Newbold and thinking about the complicated history of her grandfather. Here's someone who openly says he does not believe in equality. He's clear about his positions, but yet he believes in public education for everyone. And then you interviewed the great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. Talk a little bit about that experience and what you learned from those descendants.
That was cool meeting. Yeah, that was really cool. And he is a teacher himself now. He had a career in the military, and then he went on to teaching, and he's tried to pick up his great-grandfather's legacy and work with the youth. And he's in Augusta. Augusta State?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. But that was really cool. And Margaret Newbold as well. Now, correct me, Tom, if I'm wrong, but I believe that Newbold later changed his views on integration and so forth. Is that right? He was a segregationist to start with and changed over time.
I think his position modified over time. The gentleman that we interviewed about Mr. Newbold, Barry Malone, Dr. Malone teaches at Wake Community College, and he wrote his doctoral dissertation on Newbold, and he knows him better than just about anybody except maybe his granddaughter. I think his position moderated over time, but I don't think he stepped out of his job in the early 50s, and he was getting on up in years, so I don't know that he progressed quite as far as we would like to think he might have. But as we said in the film, he was a man of his time. He believed in everybody having a shot and being able to rise to the level of their own abilities, given the opportunities of education.
Yeah, and I think too that the idea of the film and the idea of education is what will change people's minds about and just not learning about these histories. You know, you become so impressed with what these people had to go through to get an education, and how important it was. You know, that when they were slaves, they would be beaten severely if they tried to read or tried to write, and they realized then that that was freedom. That's what freedom meant, to be able to do that, and that changed me anyway. You know, really.
Yeah, let me add something.
Yes, Mr. Stewart.
I first met Tom and Jerry, I think it was before the pandemic, and they were up in Warren County finding out about the Rosenwald schools up there. I also did quite a bit of research on my particular Rosenwald school, and N.C. Newbold was an interesting character. And I think that Dr. Malone in that film had it exactly right, that he was forward thinking in a way. For example, there were times when I would read, and there's a lot of communications between him and the state superintendent regarding the things that were going on in the Negro schools. And there were several times when I would stop and I'd go back and I'd say, now, is this a black man? Because some of the things that he was saying were things that were very progressive for the time in which he was saying them. And so I was very impressed, like Dr. Malone was, in the fact of what he was able to get done and how serious he was about improving the education for blacks here in North Carolina.
Thank you. And we all know these are intellectual folks, they're businessmen and women, and they're complicated, right? That is part of this story, is the complication of all of it. So Mr. Ben Stewart, moving on to you, let's talk a little bit about what the experience was like for you. As I want you to go back. I want
That's
you
a
to go
long
back.
way.
I want you to go take us back and talk a little bit about yourself, your upbringing, and the impact that the Rosenwald schools had on you personally, your community, if you feel so inclined to talk about that, and the trajectory of your life. So talk to us about this from a personal
Okay, how much time do we have?
Michelle, where are you? She's supposed to keep, I can't see you back there, but she's keeping me on task. But if you could wrap that up. I know that's a lot to ask, but we want to hear from someone who actually experienced this.
Yeah, I grew up in Warren County
Okay.
with my grandparents, okay? And we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of our Rosenwald School. Our school opened in 1922, so last year was the
That's
100th
wonderful.
anniversary.
That's wonderful.
But the thing is that in building our school, the initial cost for that school was about $3,500. And the black people in that community contributed $2,000 to building that school. Now, back in those days, the primary fundraiser was Brundridge stew. So you can imagine how many quarts of Brundridge stew at about a quart had to be sold to get $2,000, okay? But anyway, when I was growing up, everybody in the community took pride in the school. In fact, back in 1919, the rumor started that Warren County was getting a Rosenwald school. And things happened. The 1919 went by, 1920 went by, and nothing had been done. So one of the instructors there at the school wrote a letter to N.C. Newbold. And he said, I think that this was the beginning of conspiracy theories, okay? But he said, I think something is going on here between our county superintendent and the state superintendent, because I don't see any progress being made. And so Newbold wrote back and he gave him what I call standard answer 101. And that is blame it on the legislature. They did not appropriate money to do this. But anyway, the thing is that that school became an issue in Warren County. There were a lot of people who worked diligently, hard, put in a great effort to get that school built and get the funds raised to do that. Now, the influence that it had on me, in that community, the teachers were a part of the community. I lived with my grandparents. My grandfather was a sharecropper. He did not make enough money to file an income tax form. Legally, he did not make enough, okay? But yet and still, when it came time for me to go off to school, my ag teacher drove up to his house in his truck, said, hey, if he's gonna go to school, then he's going to need to apply for financial aid. And even though you don't qualify, you don't have to file an income tax form, you're going to need an income tax form in order to be able to fill out the financial application. And so that was the teachers worked closely with the students and the parents of those students there in Warren County and were a big influence on many, many lives there in Warren County.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart.
Yes.
Thank you. So, Dr. Smallwood, I'm going to pick on you, and the rest of you could chime in if you'd like. But I want to talk about this relationship between Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald. And I'm curious as to your thoughts about Washington's leadership in the years following emancipation. I know that as a public historian and you interact with the public all the time, you understand the different generational perspectives about Booker T. Washington and what he contributed and where he fell short or whatever the perspective might be. But can you talk about what he contributed to that partnership and why his influence was so important and that of Tuskegee in building these schools?
I get the hard question. I do want to start by saying I didn't realize that that you all had actually been in my neck of the woods, because Hamilton is right across from Indian Woods where I grew up. And I know Carol Rasco is here, who's from Indian Woods, one of my people from back home. So again, you were in my wheelhouse when you were there going through that community, because I lived back and forth across the river. I think it's important to understand that of course, Washington was a product of slavery.
Yes.
He had grown up in Virginia, was a product of slavery. And to hear those stories about the kids walking to school, that they walked 4 miles one way, to go to school, and they wore their shoes out. I mean, Booker T. Washington walked to Hampton.
That's
He
right.
walked from Western Virginia down to the coastal plains to the Tidewater to go to school at Hampton. And then, of course, that had a tremendous impact on him and developed him in terms of his understanding of the value of education. And so, again, I'm sure he saw, as many people in the rural South saw, that without an education, there wasn't very much that people could do. And that, farm life, although it helped sustain lots of people, that was the most that they could do in terms of labor. They really couldn't do much beyond that without an education. So I think his own personal upbringing really influenced his value and his understanding of what an education could do, because the education he got at Hampton was what allowed him to go down to Tuskegee and build the Tuskegee Institute. But he took his real world experiences, in terms of how do we uplift the race? How do we help African Americans achieve and do well? And he took that real world experience from the farm and he incorporated it into the institution and basically said, let's utilize the skills that we have to be successful. And then from that, when he was approached by Julius Rosenwald, again, that shared experience, I think when we go through something, we all can relate to going through something, right? If your experience might be different from mine, but when you go through something, it builds character. When you go through something, it builds resiliency, right? I mean, the greatest way to be a success is to fail. You know, I've failed many times in my life. You fail, and you learn from those failures, and you move on. And so I think that, you know, when we talk about that relationship between the two men, you know, again, Julius Rosenwald did not have a formal education, but he understood the value of an education. And think about that. Without a formal education, look at what he was able to accomplish, right? And so his point was, let's do what we can for African Americans to help them be successful. It reminds me, since you brought up North Carolina Central as well, of Dr. Shepard and Dr. Shepard's, you know, quote. And I'm going to misquote it because I usually have it printed. But his point was, in essence, was that education was expensive. But he said that, you know, the impact of not having an education is far more so. Yes. Now think about that, right? Yeah, you may not want to spend the money for education, but to educate people and give them opportunities to be successful, to care for themselves and their families, versus denying them an education and allowing them no recourse, nothing to do, it just ends up creating a situation where people are impoverished and they are undereducated and there's no room for advancement or success. So again, I would say that I think the men had a shared experience and they had life experiences that led them to understand that it was very important for society, you know, not just for the individuals who would gain from that education, but for society, that our society would be better because people were educated.
And on that note, I think the multi-layered component of that is how much education should those people have received. I think that was part of that film, is where does it stop? Because do you want someone to be educated enough to handle the sharecropping and the mechanical equipment on the farm, or do you want them liberated? And so I would ask all of you, what do you think the connection is between, at this particular point in history, where we're looking at post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, in the heat of Jim Crow South, and all the violence and the turmoil that goes with that, the relationship between agriculture, which is the economic thrust of the South, education, and economic empowerment. So, you know, what are your thoughts about that in terms of those three things, you know, intersecting at that time and the decision-making for particularly Black families? I noticed in the film, they talked about these agricultural extension agents who were going into the schools because the schools were serving as this community center at the time. So how did those three things intersect, and how do you think people decided whether or not to put money towards? I'm thinking about those $23 that gentleman said he spent 2 years begging and saving. That turned into $600. Right. And what that meant, not just his personal sacrifice, but the threats maybe that went along with that and his own personal sacrifice. So we're looking at an economic investment, people who are in rural places, and people who are striving to get education. How do those three things intersect? And how did you all put that together in a film?
Well, that's a complex question.
And we got 3 minutes.
Okay. One of the things that was impressed upon us, talking to the historians, talking to Dr. Littlefield from who grew up in Durham, her family went to the Russell School, the Russell Rosenwald School. She's now in Columbia. It was impressed upon us that, yes, Booker T. Washington's philosophy was, you know, work with your hands, learn a trade, do those things. And yes, there were rooms in the larger schools, industrial rooms, where the boys might learn how to use a hammer and a saw, and the girls, because let's face it, the girls were taught to do the women's things, to sew or to can or whatever. Dr. Littlefield's position is this, and she's talked to many Rosenwald teachers starting in the 70s and 80s. Yes, if the teacher looked out the window and saw an old car coming down the dusty road and throwing up a trail of dust, and she recognized that was the superintendent's helper, she might have the girls put down what they were doing and break out the canning equipment. But that was just for the duration. They would go back to doing what they were doing earlier, which was learning about the world, having a literature class.
Wow.
Mrs. Jones's husband, who had a PhD in education from New York University, okay, at the South Mill School, he taught his students French. Okay? Those teachers were there to open minds and give them opportunities, regardless of what the curriculum might have said about learning a trade and being prepped. I think those teachers, by and large, felt like if they could open the minds of these students, those students would take themselves forward.
That's awesome. Yes, Jerry.
One thing that impressed me right away in the design of the schools, the big windows and the movable classroom divisions, and that was way ahead of its time. And then you learn about Robert Robinson Taylor, and he was a trained architect, so he had education and was able to apply that, which went into all of these schools and made such a difference in the way kids were able to learn there and the things that they did. But the design of those schools was way ahead of its time. And that was really amazing to me. And then in talking with Dr. Tom Hanchett, who was in the film, the historian from History South, he went to school in Virginia in a white school that was built on the Rosenwald plans. They made the plans available, and anybody could pick them up and use them. And a lot of white schools did that in the rural areas, but they wouldn't let any of the black kids go, But
Wow.
Hey, I'd like to
Yes, sir.
add one comment to what has been said there concerning how important education was and where it intersected with money and everything else. But the thing is, I'm a member of the United Shiloh Missionary Baptist Association, and I did some research on that as well. But, when blacks were freed, the most important thing was the 14th Amendment and freedom. And then after that was the 16th Amendment and the right to vote. But then after that, education was the most important thing. And going back and reading through the minutes of United Shiloh Missionary Baptist Association, it's surprising how many times they talked about education and how important it was, and the fact that there was a school before there were public schools for blacks in Warren County. There was Shiloh Institute, which was like a boarding school. And at that time, that was rated the second best schools for blacks all across the state of North Carolina. So education was really important. And I'm going to run over a little bit, but also, Dr. Smallwood mentioned and Tom mentioned canning and everything, but during World War II, when things were rationed, groceries and everything, my school opened up the cafeteria, and it served as a cannery. And there was an extension agent there who would assist people in canning, how to do it and everything like that in order to preserve it. Another example of how the school got involved with the kids, one of the teachers there was a black hospital in Henderson, North Carolina. Tonsillitis was a major issue back then. And this lady, the teacher, went to the black hospital there, worked out an arrangement where kids could come and not be charged. And not only that, she took some of them there herself, and she would spend the night with them while they were being treated or while they were being operated on for tonsillitis. So again, the school was so important. Like in the film, like what you mentioned, it was the hub of the community.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. We're going to pivot to question and answer. And we've got time for maybe 3 or 4 questions. We want to hear from you, the audience. So if you have a question for our panelists, if you would raise your hand, we've got a few mic runners who are going to make sure that you're able to ask your question.
I'm so proud to be an African American. I come from New York, and this is my first. I've never been south before. I've only been down here a year, only because my daughter moved down here. And one question I wanted to ask was whether or not this film would be shared with the schools, because I have 2 grandchildren, one 15 and one 10, and I would like to have them see this film.
Tom?
Yes, the answer to that question is it will be available for them to see. Keep an eye out as we get this thing through its little PBS showing next week. We're going to make it available online, and we'll try to publicize that so that people can watch it at their leisure, in their homes, wherever they want to share it with others. The other point I'll make is that the North Carolina Humanities K through 12 group at UNC Chapel Hill became aware of this film about 8 months ago. And they reviewed it at that time, just as it was getting wrapped up. And they have included this film as a resource for North Carolina's public school teachers in the high school curriculum. So it is now publicly available for teachers and recommended for teachers to use.
One of the things I found was that in the South, I'm 85 years of age right now, and when I was young, we didn't go to doctors. My parents, the lemon was on your back, or the onion was on your back. They knew how to do things. They knew how to keep us well, and that's what I wanted to say. And the fact that the school opened up to teach them cannery, I thought that's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you so much for this opportunity. And I hope and pray with this that we do not allow the state of North Carolina to become a Texas or Florida.
So I heard you mention that there were 5,000 schools at the height of the, when they were built and being in use. And like
Throughout
you
the
said,
South.
around the South. I was raised in California, and obviously our history of the United States is very peripheral. Lived in North Carolina for about 12 years. But obviously this is focused in North Carolina. You briefly mentioned South Carolina. What about the other states? I mean, is this same effort going on in other states? How many schools are still left? I mean, and I guess, is the word going to get out there? I mean, you yourselves did know about it a lot.
The actual number of surviving schools is nebulous somewhat. Each state has tried to count the number of surviving schools. The estimates I've seen say that maybe 20% still survive across those 15 states, which range from Maryland to Texas, with a scattering of a few in Oklahoma. But it's mostly the states of the old Confederacy. Okay? About 20 years ago or so, Dr. Tom Hanchett, who you saw in the film, helped launch a revival of interest in Rosenwald schools. That led to the National Trust for Historic Preservation to kick off a campaign to make people aware, and in many communities discovered their Rosenwald schools thanks to that program. It's kind of run its course now, as things do, but there are groups in many states and in many communities throughout those 15 that are working to preserve their schools, build knowledge in the community, and share that knowledge.
Is it fair to say, though, I think one of the statistics that was mentioned in the film is that at the height of the Rosenwald schools, North Carolina had the most,
Yes, yes. And again,
which goes back to North Carolina's legacy with Black education.
yes.
Having the largest number of HBCU
Yes.
accredited HBCUs as
yeah.
well. So
I was going to wait to segue in.
Yes, sir.
But
Yes,
to the
Yeah.
point to everyone there, it was a total of 5,300 schools built over the old Confederacy and the Old South. And North Carolina had more Rosenwald schools than any other southern state, and later would have more historically Black colleges than any other southern state. Of course, the largest being North Carolina A&T, and then North Carolina Central, Winston-Salem State, Fayetteville State. But I have to say this because it's very important to the point about the role of the church in coming to Shaw in Raleigh, right? Okay. So, Shaw University was one of the first HBCUs founded after the Civil War.
Yes.
And it trained, ministers.
Absolutely.
Trained ministers and sent them all over the state of North Carolina to build churches. And remember what they said, the schools were in the churches first.
That's right.
They built churches, and the pastors educated the people, the community. And then they built the Rosenwald schools in the early 20th century with the additional funds from Julius Rosenwald. But there was always a value. People in this state always valued education. And when you talk about, for example, Shaw, and I always give Shaw its credit
Yes.
because
Yes, Mother Shaw.
A&T started at Shaw. We were at Shaw University.
I knew he was going to say that, but that's
And we moved, and we were moved from Shaw to Greensboro
That's
because the
right.
Greensboro community put together a package to build the campus there. And so, but we have a tie to Shaw.
That's right.
And so does North Carolina Central because Dr. Shepard is an alum of Shaw.
That's right.
And then he went back to North Carolina Central and built that institution. So when we talk about everything that we've talked about here on this panel and the individuals here, we have had a community in North Carolina that has valued education, and it's been holistic, and we are all family.
Absolutely.
And just to tell another story, we talk about the walking, but in our community in Bertie County, African Americans fought in all of the wars. They fought in the Civil War, came back, built churches, and educated their kids. They fought in World War I, World War II. They fought in Korea. And when they came back from the Civil War, they gave money to build the churches and educate their kids. When they came back from World War I, they gave money to buy the first flatbed trucks to truck the kids to school at Indian Woods School and the other schools in the community, in the 20th century Rosenwald School. And they always contributed. And at the church, they always gave scholarship money for the kids to go to school. And when you talk about that relationship between the A&T and education and agriculture, I mean, there have been kids that have been going to North Carolina A&T from Bertie County and from all over eastern North Carolina, really almost since it began. In fact, I was talking to the university archivist, and he was saying that all the founders, including Dudley, who came out of Wilmington, they were all former slaves. The first group of administrators at the university who built A&T, they were slaves. Had come out of slavery. So it's important to understand that, the legacies that we, the benefits, the things that we enjoy today, that, again, Rosenwald built upon what African Americans had already built, that we had already built and cared about ourselves. Because those universities were here first, and we had many of them first, right? And then from that, when we get into the early 20th century, how can we keep that machine going? How can we continue to educate people? And the last piece I got to say is that we sent people all over this country because during Jim Crow and segregation, the people that were educated at our universities and at our Rosenwald schools couldn't get jobs in North Carolina, many of them, and they had to leave and go to Philadelphia and New York and to DC, but go north to Detroit and Chicago to get jobs and opportunities. So we seeded people. We sent people all over this country. You know.
Thank you, Dr. Smallwood, for elaborating on that. I think we have time for one more question. 2 more questions? Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am. And then young man, we'll start with this lady right here. Okay.
But I would just like to say,
Yes.
I had the opportunity in 2002 to meet Rosenwald's grandson in Charlotte, North Carolina. And in 2022, when Juniper Level, Panther Branch Rosenwald School opened its doors, Rosenwald's grandson brought greetings to our school. So I thought that was
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, this-
Thank
this-
you so much. She's featured.
This is Miss Ella Perry, who was in the
Yes.
film at the
Yes.
Juniper Branch.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. Yes, she was
I
featured
told
in
her
the
she
film.
was going to be a star, so
Thank you.
and I'll be her agent.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, everyone.
Good
Thank you
evening.
again for the information that you shared about the impact that the schools have had. I'm myself a graduate of North Carolina A&T, so thank you to my provost. I graduated in 2019, but I just wanted to know what addition would this be to the UNC system, and how can it be spread to a demographic of younger folks? Because the folks here, no disrespect, but I want my generation to also have this information as well.
Yes.
I've never heard about this, and I only know about it because
Mm-hmm.
I'm a state employee through the Office of HBCU Outreach. My organization that I work for represents. So I just
Wonderful
wanted to-
question, and thank you for being here tonight. Thank you. Anyone want to?
Can I say something? Our pastor here, Reverend Jeffrey Robinson, at Juniper Level, we've had intervals where we started and stopped. And we finally completed under Dr. Reverend
Wonderful.
Yes.
He's been with us for 10 years.
Wonderful, wonderful,
In fact, we celebrated his anniversary next month.
wonderful. I want to make sure we, thank you for that announcement. I want to make sure we answer this young man's question and before we conclude.
I wish there was an easy answer to that question, but I think it starts here with everybody. There are so many people in this room. I saw the hands go up for the alumni and friends, and that's what I call the Rosenwald connection. So many people have a Rosenwald connection in their family, their heritage, their ancestors attended these schools. My Rosenwald connection is the fact that I grew up about 3 miles from a school that was a Rosenwald school, still stands today. It's in very good shape. I didn't know it was a Rosenwald school, and probably for the last 30 or 40 years it was a public school. The kids going to school there didn't know because the thread was lost. It
Right.
wasn't talked about. It was out of the headlines. JR was dead, been dead for 30, 40 years. It was just short journey school, like Panther Branch School. It was the community school. So if you have a Rosenwald connection, if you know of a school in your community, tell your family about it. Tell your kids about it. Look online. I bet you might find some history about your particular school. And the film, as we say, is going to be out there. We hope in perpetuity for people to share it and learn a little bit.
Okay. Tom Lassiter, Dr. Arwen Smallwood, Jerry Snyder, Mr. Ben Stewart, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Before you, before you all exit tonight, if you just bear with me for just a second, I also want to acknowledge all of the Rosenwald alumni that are here tonight. Thank you for your sacrifice, for your bravery, and for your example. We also want to thank the museum staff, Mr. Earl Imes. Thank you for being our gracious host. For your contributions, Ms. Michelle Carr. Thank you for your contributions as well as your coordination. Mr. Joel Rhodes and of course Jerry, I think they had to step out, but they're back. They're our tech guys, so we're very appreciative of them. JD, you too. And I want to acknowledge again our director, Mr. Ken Howard. I think our deputy director, Mr. Ken Howard, over here. Our deputy director, Ms. Maria Van, I think she is here, so thank you for being here. And all of our volunteers, Ms. Kathy East, I think she's somewhere in here. So thank you all for joining us, and we ask that you continue to look to the North Carolina Museum of History for your history, learning, and edutainment needs. And be safe. Thank you for coming tonight. Look to us for any information about how we can continue to spread the word. We are partners with Carolina K-12, Ms. Christy Norris, who is the director there. So we look forward to any information once this is put out with PBS to share with K-12 communities as well as church communities and any other communities once the film is shared. Thank you, be safe, and again, have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart.